Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the MASSP podcast. My name is Ryan Casey, and today I'm joined by Mark Ewell, Executive Director of the Michigan High School Athletic Association. He is back once again, this time to discuss how the winter sports season has been shaping up, what's ahead for spring sports, and we take a deep dive into the process of sanctioning boys volleyball and girls field hockey as official MHSAA sports. Plus, we'll talk about the growing trend of multi-sport athletes and what the future holds for high school athletics in Michigan. You won't want to miss this conversation, so let's get started. So enjoy your ride to or from school, your run on the treadmill, or however you like to listen, because another MASSP podcast episode starts now. Well, Mark, thank you so much for finding time to join the MASSP podcast once again. Really appreciate you being here.
Good to be back.
Awesome. So at the time of this recording, whether or not, I'm not sure when people will hear this by the time we get it out there, but winter season is wrapping up. I know some sports, I think, have just about already finished or are getting really, really close. So how has the winter season been going?
It's been good. The weather, while I know some places up north have gotten a ton more snow than what they had last year, I think all in all, winter has been pretty straightforward, especially, downstate. The weather's been good. Things have stayed on time, not a lot of cancellations. And, as we've talked previously, it's nice to kind of just get back to the normal ebb and flow, the normal controversies, right now, even on the tough days. And I'm sure this is for all of us in education, even on our toughest days now, just, hit the rewind button and go back 4 years as we, tried to navigate the winter of 2021. It's been very, very solid. So attendance has been good. We even had plenty of snow yesterday. As we finished up our ski championships. That's our one and only sport in the wintertime. That's outdoors, so we've gotten that one across the finish line, and it'll be an exciting here another 3 weeks as we get into toward the end of March and put winter away and look forward to the spring.
Awesome. Speaking of spring, anything newsworthy or noteworthy that you want to share? I couldn't remember if last time we talked if spring, like the tryout week was adjusted or not. Maybe I'm imagining that, but just anything spring season worthy you want to share?
So we'll really see the impact next year.
Okay.
And we haven't done anything with the start of spring sports, but what we've done, Ryan, is we've moved up the end of winter starting next year by a week.
That's what it was. Okay.
We wanted to make sure that winter sports were done about a week ahead of when schools would start to go on spring break. The really quick history, it used to be everybody would have their spring break either the first full week of April, or with some of our schools, it might even align or coincide with Easter. Well, because of that April state testing window, we've seen lots and lots of districts who now move their spring break to maybe that last full week in March. Yep. And what it did is it created some real conflicts for that last weekend of our basketball finals, whether it was boys or girls. So our boys basketball finals starting next year, and actually it just aligned on the calendar this year. Boys basketball finals will always be the weekend of the Big Ten basketball tournament. So boys is going to finish before the NCAA starts, and then girls, they're always going to be second, and the girls finals will also, be that following week. That's on the first weekend of the NCAA tournament. So the last 2 weeks of the NCAAs will be finished with all of our winter sports, which that's usually the 2 weeks that most of our schools take for spring break. So, and then of course, kind of the unintended consequences, spring coaches are going to get more access to more kids a week earlier than what they have because there's just going to be less overlap of the winter and spring. So we'll really see the full effect of that new calendar kick in next year. But with boys going first on Big Ten tournament weekend, girls the following weekend, we'll see kind of a preview of what next year will look like. Kind of the one thing that's out there yet is the Michigan State women have had an awesome season.
Yes.
They are still in the mix right now. And the way the women's tournament works is if you're a top 16 seed in the country, you get to host. Well, that's the weekend of our girls semifinals and finals. So we knew this could be a possibility, and in our plan B this year, we're all set. If we have to move, it would go to Western Michigan this year.
Okay.
So again, another Division I facility that was really important to us. The challenge, we've had two good partners over the years in Michigan and Central Michigan. Well, that weekend, both of those schools are hosting their conference's gymnastics championships. So could be a very busy weekend in our state, but
Yes.
we'll see how things with the Spartan women pan out, but we do have a plan in place.
Excellent. Otherwise, everything schedule wise for kind of spring season is kind of status quo for all of the spring sports.
Absolutely, full speed ahead, and yeah, hopefully we'll get an early spring this year. I don't know if you can, trust that groundhog in Pennsylvania,
Yeah.
but I think all of us, we're here in the last week of February when we're recording this, and can certainly tell the weather's a lot better.
Yes.
Winter has kind of subsided, and hopefully we can roll that into March.
Absolutely. I'd like to dive into now boys volleyball. So, and correct me if I'm wrong here. So, is it this spring is when boys volleyball is starting up, or is it
Next spring.
next spring? All right. So next spring it's starting up. I would really like to know, Mark, kind of what goes into bringing in a new sport kind of behind the scenes. I'm sure it's just a ton of work, and I'm sure there's things that people don't think about. I'm sure there's been proponents of different sports being added, all the time, and you probably hear people kind of lobbying to do this or do that. But I'd really like to know kind of like what are all the things that goes into making a sport become part of MHSAA or be sanctioned, and especially the things that maybe many parents or coaches or school officials don't think about.
So we start with the rule of 64. So in the handbook, we actually have a provision when it talks about sports sponsorship that we'll consider a new sport when at least 64 of our schools are participating on a club basis. So boys volleyball has been run really by kind of a group of schools out of West Michigan the last handful of years, and their numbers have continuously grown. And right now they're over 100 schools. So this current spring, when that group runs the volleyball championships for the last time before it kind of falls under our umbrella, they're going to be over 100 schools. So they met our rule of 64. And when a sport is in that situation, they then make a proposal. In this case, it went to our volleyball committee. It was unanimously supported out of the volleyball committee, and then ultimately was supported by our board. It's the first time we've added a sport in over 20 years. The last two sports that we added were back in the early 2000s when we added boys and girls lacrosse. At the time, boys lacrosse had met the rule of 64. They had at least 64 schools that were playing on a club basis. The girls weren't yet at that number. However, for us to keep our Title IX numbers and the number of sports that we offer, girls lacrosse kind of got to come along at the time, and it's now grown well over 64. So that was absolutely the right call at that time. So boys volleyball has met the number. Well, we needed then a companion girls sport to go with that, and it's girls field hockey. So girls field hockey will have their first tournament next fall. So next school year, it'll be girls field hockey in the fall, boys volleyball in the spring. That was the boys sport and the girls sport that we're able to add so that we stay under our Title IX compliance. We'll have about 45 or so schools that are playing girls field hockey. I'm not naive to know that by us sponsoring it, we're probably not going to get 200 new schools that are suddenly going to have girls field hockey. The schools in the two metro areas, Grand Rapids area and Metro Detroit. And when I say Metro Detroit, I'm also including probably the mecca of girls field hockey's in the Ann Arbor area. But in those kind of two most populated areas, the schools that have had girls field hockey will continue to have it. And like I said, we're hoping for some modest growth, but we'll have one division next fall. That's the plan, at least. Tournament, one division in girls field hockey with 40 or so some odd schools. But to answer that question, for us to consider it, 64 schools have to be participating. So the other sport right now that gets a lot of conversation because we have an NFL team in our state and the NFL team is really pushing, and the NFL in general is really pushing girls flag football.
I've seen that.
Well, I think there's lots of interest in our schools. The problem is when we surveyed this exact issue back in the fall, the number of schools who currently right now are doing something on a club basis is right now in the 20s.
Yeah.
So it's not anywhere close to that rule of 64. I think there could be some real interest. I am jealous as all get out at my colleagues in the South because they play girls flag football in the winter, which when you look at our sport offerings, that's incredibly attractive. If we could have a no-cut sport in the winter, because right now you've got girls basketball, you've got girls competitive cheer, some small pockets of schools that have gymnastics, downhill ski. But in a perfect world, oh my gosh, a high participation volume girls sport in the winter would be perfect. I like girls flag football a lot less in the fall when you now look at what other opportunities there are to compete, and I like it even less in the spring because there's even more. So you don't want to add something at the expense of a sport that you're
pulling away from others, right? Yeah.
So that's why we're going to at least take the girls flag football, and we're going to continue to hear about it. This is a big priority for the NFL, and the one thing the NFL has is money. And so right now, through the Lions, any school that would like to start it on a club basis, they'll give you a check so you can go out and buy some of those startup things. Everybody right now already has a facility, a field, coaches. It's just for us, the real challenging dynamic, if that ever would get to the 64, would be the season. So we'll cross that bridge when we get to it.
So sticking on this topic of adding a new sport, so you've made the decision, it's gone through the committee, the board has approved it. So then what work happens after that? I'm assuming there has to be work in terms of rules and regulations, and then do we have enough refs to support that? And there's refs already taking place for these games already, and I would assume like volleyball, it's pretty similar. The rules are going to be, but there's got to be a ton of work that still goes into preparing that and scheduling all those things out. Can you talk a little bit about those other issues that arise?
So with the two new sports that are coming on next school year, you could not have two more kind of different onboarding plans. The easy one is going to be boys volleyball. Everybody has a facility. The only difference is in the boys game, the net is higher. Yep. In the first 2 years, so at higher levels of men's volleyball or boys volleyball, they use a little different ball, a little different texture. Well, for our first 2 years, we've committed that we're going to use the traditional volleyball. So schools already have all the equipment. Mm-hmm. It's going to be played in your gym in the spring, which far and away is the most flexible time to schedule in the gym. You've got coaches. Now, it may not be your girls varsity coach, but you've got a staff of people in your school who right now are already coaching volleyball or already registering officials in volleyball. So you want to talk about a plug and play. The key is here very shortly. We'll be nailing down the calendar. Practice will start when all other spring sports do. When can you first start playing games? It'll be the same number of contest dates as girls volleyball. And then it's setting the back end of what's the tournament look like and when are your finals going to be. So volleyball, there's a really easy blueprint that's already there. So that's been pretty straightforward. Now, girls field hockey, the exact opposite. So they'll start when all of our other fall sports do. But the first thing we had to determine there is, okay, how many divisions are we going to play in? And it looks like we've kind of come to and this will all go to our board next month, kind of the details. Okay, we're going to play it in one division. So 40 some schools, one division. Is that regionals? Do we include a district level? When's the right time? Because of course, in the fall, the later your season goes in the fall, the more of a risk there is with weather when you're in outdoor sport. Yep. And so the connection has been awesome with the group that's been running girls field hockey for a long, long time. That was Lauren Cartwright for a lot of years, who was an Ann Arbor pioneer. And then Meg Seng, who was the recently retired AD at Green Hills School in Ann Arbor. Meg's kind of been their commissioner, for lack of a better term. Meg served a term on our board. So that onboarding has really gone very smoothly. It's just different because you don't have kind of that game plan or blueprint already there. So we found that both are kind of unique. but we did have a pretty good map to follow when it came to volleyball.
And I am just not familiar with field hockey at all. Can that be played on the football field for ones who don't? It's obviously probably a slightly different size or whatever, but there's enough space to do it on a football field?
There is, and so certainly I think that the preference is that it's played on some kind of a synthetic surface. Um, Artificial turf, the ball rolls more true and quicker
Okay.
than it does, say, on a natural grass field because those all look different. If anybody's watched high level field hockey, they actually the most preferred surface is the old artificial turf. Kind of that old carpet. My former life, I umpired a lot of college baseball, and North Carolina is the mecca for girls field hockey. Well, we dressed in the girls field hockey facility right next to the baseball stadium. Well, Ryan, every morning we get to the facility and they had sprinklers running on the old turf field. And I'm like,
Really?
what is this?
Yeah.
And they explained that with the ball and using the old turf, that you want to wet it down, which will actually, the ball will roll more true.
Huh.
And that at the highest levels of girls field hockey, that's really the ideal surface. But a lot of our
Interesting.
schools now use the rubber
Yeah.
infill surface. So we're still right now trying to figure out where our championships are going to be. I know there
Okay.
has been some interest from the University of Michigan because again, they've got a dedicated field hockey facility, which we think would be a really nice fit. But we'll kind of see how that moves forward. And occasionally in the fall, if you're channel surfing on the Big Ten Network, you will catch some
Yep.
girls field hockey, and it's a very fast-paced game. If you like defense, that's your sport. There's not a ton of scoring. There's more than soccer, but it certainly isn't,
Okay.
like lacrosse would be. Somewhat similar games. So I think for folks who are interested, it will be a really interesting watch next year.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing all that info and kind of giving us a look behind the scenes of what it takes. Obviously with my work in esports, I can appreciate all of the kind of the backwards planning that has to take place as you're figuring out regions and size and tournament size and divisions and all that stuff. So I find that really interesting. So it sounds like we'll be able to check in with you next year and get an update on how field hockey went in the fall and for boys volleyball next spring as well. Final kind of question for you here, Mark, before we get you on your way. I like checking in on kind of the data that you guys put out a couple times throughout the year. And it looks like we're still doing really, really well, especially compared to a national average with multi-sport athletes and multi-sport participation. It looks like we're holding around about 45% of the student athletes participate in more than one sport. So can you just talk a little bit about maybe MHSAA's philosophy on that and why that, I'm assuming, is a big deal or important number for you all?
So philosophically, it's something that we often talk about, from a health and safety standpoint about overuse injuries and burnout, and even when you start getting into some mental health. So I think philosophically, we've always tried to encourage kids to play multiple sports. Every year the NFL draft is just around the corner, and what you'll see is the graphic of every first round draft choice. It's generally 2/3 or more of those kids. Now, again, world-class athletes, obviously, but when they were in high school, they were not just a football only kid in most
Yep.
cases. So, but there also then needs to be some practical things that you're doing to encourage that as well. And one we just talked about was calendar and schedule. For example, good friends with my counterpart, the director in Illinois, and their basketball season in Illinois, you are allowed to play 34 regular season basketball.
Oof.
So in Illinois, basketball season starts in late October and finishes up in the end of March. Well, it's really hard in that state for your basketball kids to be multi-sport athletes. If
Oh, yeah.
basketball is your number one sport, what do you give up in the fall? What are you giving up in the spring? So part of where we try to kind of put our money where our mouth is we encourage multi-sport athletes, and we really try and arrange our 3 calendars that try and reduce as much overlap as possible. That it is still possible on the calendar to be a 2-season athlete. We talked about boys volleyball earlier. I'm hoping that next spring with boys volleyball now being an option, maybe for those basketball type kids who have said, I just want to focus on basketball and in the spring I'm just going to play AAU. Well, you know what? This might give them a little different dynamic for their decision.
Mm-hmm.
You know, still do your AAU stuff, but you know what? Here's now a secondary sport that, you know, someone who is, you know, agile, quick, tall, and can jump around the net, well, volleyball would be a great second sport for you. So, philosophically, we'll keep talking about it. From a sports medicine perspective, we'll keep talking about it. And then I also think that, you know, our calendar from a practical standpoint, we need to do that. And I also think our coaches and administrators are very, very key as well. I think all of us know in some districts where a coach of this sport or that sport seems to probably have a little bit of an outsized voice. And sometimes in those programs, you know, it's very clear that, well, my sport is the focus. And, you know, I'm not going to discourage you, but there's a little bit of a wink, wink of, hey, I need you with all of our stuff, certainly in season and out of season. And, you know, hopefully that you've got coaching staffs who are working together and not cannibalizing kids and putting them in really difficult spots to make choices. And, you know, I think most people understand that this is my primary sport. I like playing a second or an even third sport, but just know when it comes into the summer and off-season things, you know, I'm going to go first in my primary sport. And I think if there's a culture that's built within a school where, hey, this is how we are going to work together. Coaches, you're going to share kids. I think that works out really well. What I found, Ryan, is our smaller schools do that really, really well.
Yes.
Out of necessity. You know, our larger schools, I think folks become a little more tribal and, you know, this is my program and our guys or our gals. Our Division 3 and 4 schools are the ones to really look at because those coaches have to work together. And that's really something I wish some of our bigger schools would do better.
Absolutely. I appreciate that shout out because working at a rural school, that was something that I always appreciated. You know, when the football coach and the basketball coach communicate and work together. So when it's summer break time and there's 7-on-7s, but there's team camps, they're like, hey, let's figure this out so kids don't have to choose. And they got to duck out early from one, come a little late to the other. We'll make that work. So I always appreciated that as an administrator when you see that happen. So, well, I've got to get you back because I know you've got more winter sports to wrap up and prep for the spring. So as always, Mark, I really appreciate the time and hopefully we can check in again next school year a couple times like we've done the past couple years and continue to hear all the great things that MHSAA is doing for our student athletes.
Sounds great. Thanks, Ryan.
And that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you for listening to the MASSP podcast. Remember, you can listen to this podcast and others anywhere you get your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. Just search for MASSP or hit the subscribe button right now.